On the morning of October 28, 1963, a light rain was falling on 7th Avenue. A small group of protesters stood in black armbands, watching in silence as electric jackhammers bit into pink granite that had taken 4 years to quarry, shape, and raise. But this was not a construction site. This was an execution. Pennsylvania Station, the largest and most beautiful train terminal ever built in America, was being torn apart, column by column, eagle by eagle, and hauled to the swamps of New Jersey. No one had saved it. No law could stop it. And nothing would ever replace what vanished that morning. This is the story of a building that was conceived as a monument to permanence and destroyed in just 3 years because the society that inherited it could not find a way to value beauty that did not generate revenue. Chapter 1: The Railroad That Could Not Reach New York. By 1899, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest corporation on Earth, and it had a problem that money alone could not solve. The company owned more than 10,000 miles of track. It moved more freight than any enterprise in human history. Its locomotives hauled coal from the Appalachian seams, steel from the mills of Pittsburgh, grain from the flatlands of Ohio, and passengers from Washington, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and 100 smaller cities in between. The Pennsylvania Railroad was, by almost any measure, the most powerful private company the world had ever known. And yet, every single day, its passengers suffered a humiliation that no amount of corporate power could erase. They could not reach Manhattan. Every train bound for New York City stopped at a terminal in Jersey City, on the western bank of the Hudson River. From there, passengers gathered their luggage, stepped off the platform, crossed a windy pier, and boarded a ferry. In good weather, the crossing took roughly 20 minutes. In winter fog, in the chopping gray water of January, with ice clinging to the pilings and the Manhattan skyline a ghost behind the mist, the ferry ride could feel like an eternity. Businessmen in wool coats stood on open decks. Women held their hats against the wind. Children pressed their faces to the rail. And somewhere across the water, their rival was laughing. The Vanderbilt family's New York Central Railroad had what the Pennsylvania Railroad did not: a direct route into the heart of Manhattan. Grand Central Depot, rebuilt and expanded in 1898, sat at 42nd Street and Park Avenue, the commercial spine of the city. The New York Central's passengers stepped off their trains and walked into the streets of Midtown. The Pennsylvania Railroad's passengers stepped off their trains and waited for a boat. It was a geographic humiliation, and it had persisted for decades. The man who decided to end it was Alexander Cassatt. He was 59 years old in 1899, and he had already been retired for 17 years. Cassatt had risen through the ranks of the Pennsylvania Railroad as a young engineer, becoming its vice president before he was 40. But in 1882, disgusted by a rate war and the internal politics of the company, he resigned and retreated to his estate at Chesterbrook Farm in Chester County, Pennsylvania. For 17 years, he bred horses, raised cattle, and lived the quiet life of a country gentleman. He was not a man who sought attention. Where the railroad barons of his era built mansions on Fifth Avenue and threw parties that made the society pages, Cassatt kept to his farm. He was tall, bearded, austere. He spoke little. He listened carefully. He made decisions slowly and then held to them with a stubbornness that could feel, to those who disagreed, like a kind of violence. His sister was Mary Cassatt, the Impressionist painter, the only American admitted to the inner circle of Degas, Monet, and Renoir. She would become one of the most celebrated artists in history. Alexander would become, if he is remembered at all, a footnote in the history of railroads. It is one of the stranger paradoxes of the Gilded Age. The brother ran the largest corporation on earth and vanished from memory, while the sister painted mothers and children in soft pastels and became immortal. In 1899, the board of the Pennsylvania Railroad called Cassatt out of retirement and elected him president. They needed someone who could solve the New York problem. Cassatt accepted. And within months, he had conceived the most audacious construction project in the history of American transportation. He would tunnel under the Hudson River. He would bore through the bedrock of Manhattan. He would build a terminal so vast, so grand, and so permanent that it would stand as a monument not just to the railroad, but to the city itself. And then he would continue the tunnels eastward, under the East River, connecting Manhattan to Long Island and eliminating the last bottleneck in his system. It was a bet of staggering scale. The total cost would eventually exceed $114 million, a figure equivalent to roughly $2.7 billion in today's money. It would require the demolition of 500 buildings, the excavation of 3 million cubic yards of rock, and the employment of thousands of workers, many of whom would risk their lives in tunnels buried beneath the floor of a river. But Cassatt did not hesitate. He had spent 17 years watching from his farm as the problem festered. Now he would solve it. The question was not whether the project was possible. The question was whether he could find an architect who understood what the building had to mean. Chapter 2. The Men Who Dreamed in Marble. Charles Follen McKim did not design buildings. He built arguments in stone for how civilized people ought to live. He was the senior partner of McKim, Mead and White, the most celebrated architectural firm in the United States. The firm had designed the Boston Public Library, the campus of Columbia University, the Rhode Island State Capitol, and dozens of the grandest private homes in America. McKim himself was a disciple of the Beaux-Arts tradition, trained in Paris, devoted to the classical forms of Greece and Rome. He believed that architecture was not merely functional, it was moral. A great building did not simply shelter people from the rain, it told them who they were. Cassatt chose McKim because both men shared a conviction that bordered on obsession. The new terminal must not be merely useful. It must be magnificent. This was not an obvious position. Train stations, in the popular imagination, were practical structures. They were places people passed through on their way to somewhere else. The prevailing wisdom of American railroading held that terminals should be well lit and easy to navigate. They did not need to inspire awe. They needed to move passengers. Cassatt and McKim rejected this entirely. They looked not to the train sheds of Europe, but to the public monuments of ancient Rome. McKim traveled to Italy, sketchbook in hand, and stood in the ruins of the baths of Caracalla, the vast bathing complex that had served the citizens of Rome in the 3rd century. He studied the Basilica of Constantine, the colossal audience hall built in the 4th century, whose coffered ceilings rose more than 100 feet above the marble floors. What McKim saw in these ruins was not mere grandeur. He saw a philosophy. The Romans had built public spaces that treated every citizen as worthy of beauty. A laborer and a senator entered the same baths, sat beneath the same vaulted ceiling, felt the same sense of scale. The building did not sort people by class, it elevated everyone. McKim brought this idea back to New York and planted it in 7th Avenue. The partnership between Cassatt and McKim was unusual. Both men were reserved to the point of silence. Neither enjoyed small talk. Neither cared for publicity. They communicated in drawings, in long silences, punctuated by brief sentences of startling precision. Cassatt would review McKim's plans and say almost nothing, offering his approval not in words, but in the absence of objection. McKim would interpret this silence as trust and press forward. What emerged from this partnership was a design of overwhelming ambition. The main waiting room would stretch 277 feet, 108 feet wide, and 150 feet from floor to ceiling. Its dimensions were modeled directly on the central hall of the baths of Caracalla. The ceiling would be coffered in the Roman manner, with panels that receded in geometric progression toward a distant vault. The walls would be clad in travertine, the same warm, honey-colored stone that faced the Colosseum. The exterior would present 84 Doric columns of pink Milford granite, each 35 feet tall, marching in solemn rows along 7th Avenue and 31st Street. The columns would support an entablature decorated with carved eagles, and behind them, a concourse of glass and steel would arch over the train platforms like a cathedral of light. The design said something radical. A train station could be the most important building in a city. It could be the place where the city announced itself to the world. Every person who arrived in New York by rail, whether they were a banker from Philadelphia or a farmer from Ohio, would step into a room that made them feel the weight of the city's ambition and the dignity of their own arrival. Neither Cassatt nor McKim would live to see the building completed. Cassatt died on December 28, 1906, at the age of 66. The cause was listed as heart failure, but those close to him knew that the strain of the project and a series of corporate scandals had broken his health. He had driven himself without rest for 7 years. He had committed the finances of the world's largest corporation to the most expensive building project in American history, and he died before a single column was raised above ground. McKim survived him by 3 years, but barely. The architect suffered a nervous collapse in 1907, brought on by overwork and the recent deaths of several close friends. He continued to oversee the project from his sickbed, reviewing drawings and approving revisions. He died on September 14, 1909, at the age of 62. The station was still more than a year from completion. The building that rose in their absence was the product of 2 men who poured themselves into its creation and were consumed by it. It was an orphan from the day it opened, and the question that would haunt its entire existence was already taking shape. What happens when a building outlives the men who imagined it, when no one remains who remembers why it had to be this grand? Chapter 3, 8 acres torn from the earth. Before a single column could rise, more than 500 buildings had to come down, and 3 million cubic yards of Manhattan bedrock had to be blasted from the ground. The site chosen for the station stretched from 31st Street to 33rd Street, from 7th Avenue to 9th Avenue. It covered nearly 8 acres of Midtown Manhattan, an area larger than many small towns, and every inch of it was already occupied. The Pennsylvania Railroad, knowing that land prices would skyrocket the moment its plans became public, moved with extraordinary secrecy. In 1901, the company created a front called the Stuyvesant Real Estate Company and began quietly buying up parcels, lot by lot, building by building. The neighborhood was one of the poorest in Midtown. Tenements, boarding houses, small factories, saloons, and stables. The residents were largely immigrant families, Irish and German and Italian, crowded into airless rooms above shops that faced unpaved streets. Over the course of 2 years, the railroad's agents purchased more than 500 individual properties. Hundreds of families were displaced. The historical record offers little detail about where these people went or what compensation they received. The railroad was a private company operating under the laws of the time, and the laws of the time gave enormous latitude to any buyer with enough money. The human cost of the site clearance was substantial. It was also, in the calculus of 1901, unremarkable. Cities tore down neighborhoods and built new ones. That was called progress. By 1903, the demolition was complete and the excavation began. Workers blasted through layers of Manhattan schist, the ancient metamorphic rock that gives the island its foundation. 3 million cubic yards of stone and earth were removed from the site. To put that figure in scale, it would fill roughly 1 million dump trucks, a line of vehicles stretching from New York City to Denver, Colorado. The hole they dug reached 60 feet below street level. Into this crater, the builders poured the skeleton of a colossus. 650 steel columns were sunk into the bedrock to support the station above. The steel frame was among the heaviest ever assembled in New York, a grid of beams and girders that would bear the weight of granite, travertine, glass, and the daily transit of hundreds of thousands of humans. The granite began arriving from Milford, Massachusetts. More than 500,000 cubic feet of pink Milford granite were quarried, cut, and shipped to New York by rail and barge. The The stone was a warm, rosy gray, tinged with feldspar, and it gave the building a color unlike anything else in Manhattan. Every block was hand-finished. The stonemasons who shaped the columns and carved the eagles were among the most skilled craftsmen in the country, men who had learned their trade cutting stone for churches and courthouses and public libraries across New England. 84 Doric columns rose along the facade. Each column was a single piece of granite, 35 feet tall, weighing several tons. The columns were not merely they were structural elements that supported the great entablature above, and they gave the building its signature presence on 7th Avenue, a wall of stone that announced, without apology, that this was a building of consequence. Inside, the main waiting room took shape as one of the largest interior spaces ever enclosed in the Western Hemisphere. 277 feet long, 108 feet wide, 150 feet from floor to ceiling. The room was clad in travertine, the same stone used on the facades of ancient Rome, imported from quarries in Tivoli, Italy. The coffered ceiling was modeled on the baths of Caracalla, each panel receding in careful proportion, drawing the eye upward toward a vault of pale gold. The concourse behind the waiting room was a marvel of a different kind. Where the waiting room looked backward to Rome, the concourse looked forward to the age of steel and glass. A lattice of iron arches supported a roof of frosted glass panels that flooded the space with natural light. The effect was of standing inside a greenhouse, the size of a cathedral, a bright, airy counterpoint to the heavy solemnity of the waiting room. Below the concourse, the platforms descended through multiple levels to the tunnels that reached beneath the rivers on either side of Manhattan. 22 stone eagles, carved by the sculptor Adolf Weinmann, perched along the exterior walls, each weighing several tons. Weinmann also created the pair of sculptures known as Day and Night, two allegorical figures flanking the great clock on the 7th Avenue facade. Day was a female figure bathed in sunlight, her arms open in welcome. Night was a hooded figure descending into shadow. Together they measured time at the threshold of the station, marking the endless cycle of arrival and departure. The station opened on November 27, 1910. The total cost reached $114 million, a sum equivalent to roughly $2.7 billion in modern currency. It was the most expensive building ever constructed in the United States at that time. It was also, by almost universal acclaim, the most beautiful. The New York Times called it a monument to the civilization of a city. Architectural critics compared it, without irony, to the public buildings of Imperial Rome. Ordinary passengers, arriving from Baltimore or Trenton or the small towns of central Pennsylvania, stepped off their trains and climbed the stairs into the waiting room and simply stopped. They stood still and looked up. The ceiling was impossibly far away. The light was warm and golden. The stone was the color of a sunset. For a factory worker or a traveling salesman or a mother with children, this was the first room they entered when they arrived in New York City. It told them, before they had taken a dozen steps, that the city considered them worthy of this, that a building could be a form of respect. The station was alive. It breathed. It waited. And for 53 years, it would serve the city that built it until the city decided it was no longer worth keeping. Chapter 4, the Cathedral Beneath the River. The most dangerous part of Pennsylvania Station was the part no one ever saw. Passengers arriving on the platform level of the station descended stairs into a clean, well-lit space of tiled corridors and iron columns. They did not think about what lay beyond the walls. They did not imagine the tunnels that stretched beneath the Hudson River to the west and the East River to the east, 16 miles of subterranean passageway carved through silt, gravel, and bedrock by men working in conditions that bordered on the unimaginable. These tunnels were the true engineering marvel of the project, the foundation upon which the entire station rested, and they were built at a cost in human suffering that the marble waiting room above would never acknowledge. The idea of tunneling under the Hudson was not new. It had been attempted before, and it had ended in disaster. In 1874, a company led by Dewitt Clinton Haskin began boring a tunnel from the Jersey City side, using compressed air to hold back the river water that pressed against the tunnel walls. The method was crude, and the technology was primitive. On July 21, 1880, a section of the tunnel roof collapsed. River water and silt poured into the shaft. 20 workers, the men known as sandhogs, were killed. The project was abandoned. The tunnel sat unfinished for more than 2 decades, a flooded tomb beneath the river. Cassatt's engineers studied the failed attempt and developed new methods. The tunnels would be bored using shields, massive iron cylinders fitted with cutting edges that were pushed forward by hydraulic jacks. Behind the shield, workers lined the tunnel with cast iron rings, bolted together segment by segment, forming a watertight tube. The air inside the tunnel was pressurized to keep the river water out, creating an environment that was brutally hostile to the human body. The sandhogs who worked these tunnels were among the toughest laborers in the country. Many were Irish immigrants or the sons of immigrants, men who had grown up in the tenements of the Lower East Side and Hell's Kitchen. They descended into the pressurized chambers through airlocks, spending hours at a time in an atmosphere of compressed air that pressed against their eardrums, their sinuses, their lungs. The work was done in near total darkness, in heat that could reach 110 degrees, in air so thick with moisture that sweat ran down their bodies in sheets. They worked in shifts, 4 to 6 hours at a time, and when they emerged from the airlock, they were often dizzy, nauseated, and covered in mud from head to boots. They earned roughly $2.50 a day, a premium above ordinary construction wages, but still a working man's pay for a job that could kill without. The river was always there, pressing against the tunnel walls. The sandhogs could feel it. The sound of the water seeping through cracks in the iron lining was a constant hiss, a reminder that they were working in a tube buried in silt beneath millions of tons of river. One wrong calculation, one thin spot in the rock above, and the Hudson would come in. The medical dangers were severe. Cassatt disease, now known as decompression sickness or the bends, was a constant threat. When workers returned too quickly to normal atmospheric pressure, nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood and tissues, causing agonizing pain in the joints, paralysis, and sometimes death. The company employed a physician to supervise the decompression process, but the science was imperfectly understood, and there were also blowouts, terrifying events in which the compressed air found a weak spot in the river bottom and erupted through the silt, creating a column of water and air that shot upward through the riverbed and into the open water above. During a blowout, the air pressure in the tunnel dropped instantly, the river rushed in, and the workers had seconds to scramble for the airlock before the tunnel flew. Several blowouts occurred during the construction of the Hudson River tubes. Men were blown out of the tunnel and upward through the river, ejected like corks from a bottle, and somehow survived. 2 tubes were bored under the Hudson River, running from New Jersey to Manhattan. 4 tubes were bored under the East River, connecting Manhattan to Long Island. The combined length of the tunnel system was approximately 16 miles. The scale of the operation was extraordinary. More than 8,000 men worked on the tunnel project at its peak, divided among multiple crews boring simultaneously from opposite ends. They consumed vast quantities of compressed air, pumped through iron mains from compressor stations on the riverbank. The electricity required to power the compressors and the excavation machinery would have lit a small city. When the 2 bores of the Hudson River Tunnel met in the middle, beneath the riverbed, the alignment error was 1/16 of an inch. 1/16 of an inch in a tunnel more than a mile long, bored from opposite sides through unstable ground under a river. The surveyors who achieved this precision worked with optical instruments mounted on tripods in the dark, sighting along plumb lines in conditions of suffocating heat and crushing pressure. It was an achievement of human precision that bordered on the miraculous. Above ground, the station itself concealed its own hidden infrastructure. A power plant across 31st Street generated the electricity that ran the trains and lit the building. Beneath the platforms, a labyrinth of service corridors, baggage rooms, and mechanical spaces kept the station functioning. There were separate waiting rooms for women, furnished with cushioned chairs and attended by matrons. There were private carriageways that allowed wealthy passengers to arrive by horse-drawn carriage or early automobile and descend directly to the platform level without passing through the public concourse. The station was, beneath its democratic facade, a finely graded machine for sorting people by class. But the deepest irony of the station's design would not become apparent for another half-century. The parts of the station that passengers admired, the granite columns, the travertine walls, the glass and steel concourse, the carved eagles, the coffered ceiling of the waiting room, all of these would be destroyed, torn down, smashed, hauled away, buried. The parts that no one saw, the parts that no one praised, the tunnels and platforms carved from the bedrock of Manhattan by sandhogs who risked their lives in compressed air beneath the Hudson River, these would survive. They survive today. More than 300,000 passengers pass through them every day, riding trains through the same tubes that were bored between 1904 and 1908. The tunnels have outlasted the building they were built to serve. The sandhogs built something permanent, the architects built something beautiful, and the men who came after them decided that beauty was disposable, but function was not. This was the hidden truth of Pennsylvania Station. Its most celebrated features were also its most vulnerable. Granite could be broken, travertine could be stripped from the walls, glass could be shattered, and steel could be cut. But a tunnel bored through the bedrock beneath a river, lined with cast iron and reinforced with concrete, that was something even greed could not easily destroy. The building above was heading for a reckoning it could not survive. Chapter 5. The Palace that became a burden. The station reached its peak in 1945 when 109 million passengers passed through its halls. And then the world changed beneath it. 109 million. That figure is almost impossible to absorb. The entire population of the United States in 1945 was roughly 140 million people. In a single year, a number equivalent to more than 3/4 of every man, woman, and child in the country walked through the doors of Pennsylvania Station. The building was alive in a way that no other structure in America could match. Its waiting room was a vast, humming theater of human motion, a crossroads where soldiers returned from war, where families reunited, where businessmen caught the afternoon congressional limited to Washington, and newlyweds boarded sleeper cars bound for Florida. The station was built for this. Its scale, which had seemed grandiose when it opened in 1910, now felt necessary. The waiting room could hold thousands of people without feeling crowded. The concourse, flooded with natural light from its glass ceiling, moved rivers of passengers toward platforms that served more than 1,000 trains a day. The building worked, and then it stopped working, not because anything in the building failed, but because the country decided it no longer wanted to travel by train. The transformation was swift and devastating. In 1945, railroads carried roughly 77% of all intercity passenger traffic in the United States. By 1950, that number had fallen to 46%. By 1960, it was 27%. By 1970, it would fall below 7%. Two forces drove this collapse. The first was the automobile. The Interstate Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Dwight Eisenhower, authorized the construction of 40 1,000 miles of limited-access highways connecting every major city in America. The federal government would pay 90% of the cost. The highways were free to use. The railroads, by contrast, had to maintain their own tracks, their own stations, their own rolling stock, and pay property taxes on all of it. The competition was not merely unfair, it was annihilating. The second force was the airplane. Commercial aviation, which had been a novelty before the war, exploded in the late 1940s and 50s. Airlines offered speed that the railroads could not match. A flight from New York to Chicago took 3 hours. The train took 16. A flight from New York to Washington took 45 minutes. The train took 4 hours. For the business traveler, the calculation was simple. Time was money. The airplane saved time. The train lost. The shift was visible in the station itself. The great waiting room, designed for crowds that no longer came, grew emptier with each passing year. The long wooden benches, once filled with soldiers and families and salesmen, now sat half vacant on weekdays. The ticket windows, once staffed by dozens of clerks, began to close. The dining room, which had served thousands of meals a day during the war, cut its hours, reduced its menu, and eventually shuttered. The newsstand operators, the shoe-shin men, the redcaps who carried luggage for tips, all of them felt the thinning of the human current that had sustained them. The Pennsylvania Railroad watched its passenger revenues evaporate. The trains that had once been the proud flagships of the fleet, the Broadway Limited, the Congressional, the Spirit of St. Louis, ran with fewer and fewer passengers. Empty seats multiplied, dining cars were cut, sleeping car service was reduced, coach cars that had once been full were now half empty, their plush seats wearing thin without the revenue to replace them. Service deteriorated because there was no money to maintain it, and service deterioration drove away the passengers who remained. It was a death spiral, and the station was caught in its center. The building began to show the strain. Maintenance budgets were slashed. The travertine walls grew dark with soot, the bronze fixtures tarnished. The great windows of the concourse, once washed and kept gleaming, were allowed to film over with grime. The carved eagles, which had once presided over the entrance with an air of imperial authority, now looked down on a building that was slowly dying of neglect. The cultural climate of the era offered the station no protection. The 1950s and 60s were the age of urban renewal, a movement driven by the conviction that American cities were obsolete and needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Robert Moses, the master builder who reshaped New York City for more than 3 decades, championed a vision of urban progress that treated old buildings as obstacles. He bulldozed entire neighborhoods to build highways and housing projects. In Moses's New York, the past was something to be cleared away, not preserved. There was no law in New York City that could prevent the owner of a building from tearing it down. A building could be a masterpiece. It could be a century old. It could be loved by millions. None of that mattered. If the owner held the title, the owner held the hammer. Pennsylvania Station was privately owned. The Pennsylvania Railroad could do whatever it wanted with it. This absence of legal protection was not an oversight. It was a reflection of how America thought about property. The right to develop, alter, or destroy one's own property was considered fundamental, nearly sacred. The idea that the government could tell a private owner to preserve a building for the public good was considered radical, almost socialist. In the early 1960s, even the most committed preservationists struggled to articulate a legal theory that could override property rights in the name of beauty. And what the railroad wanted, increasingly, was to be rid of it. The station had become an embarrassment. The building that had once announced the glory of arrival in New York now seemed to announce only the obsolescence of the railroad itself. The grand waiting room, designed for 100 million passengers, now served a fraction of that number. The vast spaces felt not grand, but empty. The grime that covered the walls and windows turned the warm travertine cold and the bright concourse dim. Critics who had once compared the building to the baths of Caracalla now compared it to a bus station. The building was still there. The columns still stood. The eagles still watched. But something essential had been lost. The building had been designed to express confidence, to project permanence, to make the case that civilization could build things of lasting beauty. Now it expressed only the opposite. It looked like a monument to something that had failed. A building designed to last forever had begun to look temporary. and somewhere in the executive offices of the Pennsylvania Railroad, men in gray suits were studying a set of numbers that would seal its fate. Chapter 6, the air above was worth more than the stone below. In 1960, the Pennsylvania Railroad did the math and discovered that the empty sky above its station was more valuable than the building itself. The concept was called air rights, the legal right to build in the space above a piece of property. In Midtown Manhattan, where every square foot of real estate generated extraordinary revenue, the air above Pennsylvania Station represented millions of dollars in untapped value. The station itself, with its columns and eagles and soaring waiting room, occupied 8 acres of the most expensive land in the world and generated almost no income. The trains were half empty. The retail spaces were declining. The building was not an asset. It was a liability. The railroad began entertaining proposals from developers. The most aggressive came from Irving Mitchell Felt, the president of the Madison Square Garden Corporation. Felt's plan was audacious in its simplicity: tear down the station above ground, build a new Madison Square Garden arena and a large office tower on the site, and construct a smaller, cheaper, underground station beneath the new buildings. The railroad would receive the new station at no cost, plus a 25% ownership stake in the garden. It would be relieved of the crushing expense of maintaining the old building. It would gain a stream of rental income from the office tower. And it would never again have to look at those granite columns and wonder how to pay for their upkeep. Felt announced the plan in 1962. The reaction was immediate and fierce, but it was also inadequate. The financial terms were strikingly favorable to the railroad. The new underground station would be built entirely at the developer's expense, saving the railroad the capital cost of maintaining or replacing its own facility. The 25% ownership stake in the garden would generate income for decades. The office tower would produce rental revenue from commercial tenants willing to pay premium rates for a midtown address. From the railroad's perspective, the deal was obvious. It turned a financial drain into a financial engine. From every other perspective, the deal was a catastrophe. A group of architects, critics, and civic leaders formed an organization called the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, known by its acronym AGBNY. The group was led by some of the most prominent names in American architecture and design. They organized what may have been the most genteel protest in the history of urban activism. On August 2nd, 1962, several hundred people marched in a picket line outside the station. The photographs from that day are almost painfully polite. Men in dark suits and narrow ties, women in white gloves and pearls, signs lettered with calligraphic precision: shame, don't demolish it, action, not apathy. Save our heritage. The protesters looked like they were attending a cocktail party at which someone had made an unfortunate remark. Philip Johnson, the architect, marched. Jane Jacobs, the urbanist, lent her voice. Eleanor Roosevelt spoke in support. Norman Mailer wrote in defense of the station. Ada Louise Huxtable, the architecture critic of the New York Times, wrote column after column urging the city to intervene. It was not enough. The protests had no legal force. There was no law that could compel the Pennsylvania Railroad to preserve its building. The city government, under Mayor Robert Wagner, expressed sympathy but took no action. The railroad was a private company doing what private companies do, managing its assets for the benefit of its shareholders. If the asset was worth more as an arena and an office tower than as a train station, then the asset would be converted. That was not vandalism. That was business. The protesters understood this, and it was the source of their despair. They were not fighting a villain. They were fighting arithmetic. The revenue per square foot of a modern office building was many times greater than the revenue per square foot of a granite train station. The financial argument was unanswerable, and in a city that ran on money, an unanswerable financial argument was the same thing as a verdict. Supporters of the demolition made their case in the language of progress. The old station was inefficient. It was outdated. It consumed resources that could be put to productive use. A new arena would bring sports and entertainment to Midtown, drawing fans and tourists and spending. A new office tower would generate tax revenue and create jobs. The underground station would still serve passengers. The trains would still run. What was being lost, really, except some old stone? The defenders of the station tried to answer this question, and they found that the English language was almost inadequate to the task. How do you explain the value of a 150-foot ceiling to a man who measures value in dollars per square foot? How do you argue that the experience of walking through a room matters, that the quality of light falling through a glass roof can change how a person feels about arriving in a city? These were real values. They shaped real lives. But they could not be entered into a ledger. What was being lost was something that could not be expressed in the language of square footage and revenue. What was being lost was the idea that a public space should be beautiful for its own sake, that a building could ennoble the daily experience of ordinary people, that the act of arriving in a great city deserved a room of consequence. These were values that the market could not price, and because the market could not price them, the market would not save them. The approvals moved forward. The city's Board of Estimate gave its consent. The demolition contract was awarded, the cranes and jackhammers were ordered. And on a gray morning in October of 1963, the first blow fell on pink granite that had been quarried, carved, and raised by men who believed they were building something permanent. But the blow that fell that morning would echo far longer than anyone expected. It would change the law. It would transform how American cities thought about their past, and it would create a guilt so powerful that it would reshape the skyline of New York. Chapter 7, the day the jackhammers came. On October 28, 1963, in a light rain, protesters wearing black armbands watched as the first blow fell on pink Milford granite. The demolition of Pennsylvania Station was not a swift death. It was a slow, methodical dismemberment that lasted 3 years, from 1963 to 1966. The building was not blown up or knocked down in a single dramatic gesture. It was taken apart piece by piece, floor by floor, column by column, as if the demolition crew were performing an autopsy on a body that was still, in some sense, alive. Trains continued to run through the station even as the walls came down around them. The first elements to go were the decorative features, the carved stone eagles, 22 of them, each weighing several tons, were pried from their perches along the exterior walls. Workers attached cables to the eagles and lowered them to flatbed trucks waiting on 7th Avenue. The eagles, designed by Adolph Weinman to embody the fierce pride of the Republic, were handled with the casual efficiency of men moving furniture. Some were donated to institutions. Many were simply hauled away. The 84 Doric columns came next. These were the defining features of the station's facade, the 35-foot pillars of pink granite that had given the building its Roman authority. Each column was a single piece of stone, quarried and shaped by hand more than half a century earlier. They could not be salvaged whole. They were too heavy, too large, and there was nowhere to put them. The demolition crews broke them apart with jackhammers and pneumatic drills, reducing them to rubble. The rubble was loaded onto trucks and driven west, across the George Washington Bridge or through the Lincoln Tunnel to the marshlands of New Jersey. The main waiting room, the heart of the building, was stripped methodically. The travertine walls were torn from their steel frames. The bronze railings and fixtures were pulled out and sold for scrap. The great coffered ceiling, modeled on the baths of Caracalla, was brought down in sections. The floor, laid in patterns of marble and stone, was broken up with sledgehammers. The glass and steel concourse, the cathedral of light that had flooded the platform level with sunshine for more than 50 years, was dismantled. The iron arches were unbolted and the glass panels removed. The lattice framework that McKim's partners had designed to bring the sky into the building was cut apart with acetylene torches, the blue flames hissing in the dark. Where natural light had once poured in from above, there would eventually be nothing but the concrete underbelly of a sports arena. The sounds of the demolition carried for blocks. The grinding of jackhammers on stone, the crash of masonry falling into steel dumpsters, the whine of cutting tools on metal, the rumble of trucks on 7th Avenue, loaded with rubble, pulling out in a slow procession toward the tunnels and bridges that led to New Jersey. Dust hung in the air around the site, a fine powder of ground granite and plaster that settled on the suits of office workers and the coats of pedestrians. The building was releasing itself back into the atmosphere, one particle at a time. 2 days after the demolition began, Ada Louise Huxtable published an editorial in the New York Times that would become one of the most quoted passages in the history of American architecture. She wrote of the loss with a precision that cut through the usual language of preservation advocacy and arrived at something harder, something that sounded less like a plea and more like a verdict. The editorial concluded with words that have been repeated so often they have become a kind of epitaph for the building itself. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and, ultimately, deserves. The demolition continued through 1964 and 1965. Workers tore through the building with a steadiness that had its own grim momentum. Photographs from the period show the station in progressive states of ruin, walls missing, columns toppled, the sky visible through gaps in the ceiling. In some images, passengers are visible on the platforms below, waiting for trains. Surrounded by dust and debris, the remnants of carved stone and bent steel piled around them like the ruins of a bombed city. The violence of the demolition was not lost on those who witnessed it. Architects and preservationists returned again and again to watch, as if compelled by the same instinct that draws people to funerals. They stood on 7th Avenue and watched the trucks carry away the stone. They photographed the wreckage. Some wept. But the city, the great mass of New Yorkers who passed the site on their way to work and home, did not stop. The demolition was covered in the newspapers, debated on television, mourned in editorials, and then the next news cycle arrived and the city moved on. The trucks kept coming, the jackhammers kept grinding, and the building kept dying, one truckload at a time. By 1966, it was over. The above-ground portion of Pennsylvania Station, the most beautiful train terminal ever built in America, was gone. Where the pink granite columns had stood, there was now a construction site. Where the glass concourse had flooded the platforms with light, there was now open sky, soon to be replaced by the circular concrete drum of the new Madison Square Garden. The building had taken 7 years to build and 3 years to destroy. It had stood for 53 years. It had served hundreds of millions of passengers, and it was gone. But the stone had to go somewhere. #Chack Chapter 8, Roman Columns in a New Jersey Swamp. The remains of the most beautiful train station in America were trucked to the Meadowlands and dumped alongside pig farm refuse. This is not a metaphor. This is what happened. Hundreds of truckloads of pink Milford granite, the stone that had been quarried in Massachusetts, shipped to New York, carved by master stonemasons, and raised into columns that made passengers feel they were entering a modern Rome, were driven to the marshes of Secaucus, New Jersey, and deposited in landfill. The columns that had lined 7th Avenue came to rest in a swamp surrounded by pig farms, alongside household garbage, construction debris, and industrial waste. The image is so grotesque that it seems designed for maximum symbolic effect. But it was not symbolic, it was logistical. The demolition produced an enormous volume of stone and rubble. It had to go somewhere. The Meadowlands, a vast expanse of tidal marshland across the Hudson River, had served as a dumping ground for New York City's refuse for decades. Penn Station's remains joined the accumulated waste of a metropolis. The pink granite that had been intended to last centuries was buried in mud. Not everything was discarded so carelessly. The 22 Weinman Eagles were dispersed across the East Coast, scattered like relics from a demolished cathedral. 2 went to the Cooper Union in Manhattan, where they stand in a courtyard that few people visit. 1 went to the Central Park Zoo, One ended up at the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point on Long Island. Others found their way to the Smithsonian Institution, to private collections, to the Market Street Bridge in Philadelphia. The Eagles survived, but they survived in exile, separated from the building that gave them context and meaning. The fate of the day and night clock sculptures was grimmer. Weinman's allegorical figures, the two great symbols of time and passage that had flanked the 7th Avenue clock, were removed during the demolition and treated with astonishing carelessness. Two of the figures were dumped in the Meadowlands along with the granite. One was shipped to Kansas City, Missouri, where it sat in storage for years. Half of one figure was recovered decades later from a recycling depot in the Bronx, salvaged from what was essentially a junkyard. That fragment, half of a masterpiece, half of a sculpture that had once measured time at the entrance to the grandest room in America, was eventually cleaned, restored, and placed on display at the Brooklyn Museum. It sits there today, a broken piece of a broken building, preserved behind glass in a gallery that most visitors walk past without stopping. The bronze statue of Alexander Cassatt, the man who had conceived the station and died before seeing it completed, was removed from the main waiting room before the demolition and sent to a railroad museum in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, Thayer, in a small town in Lancaster County, surrounded by preserved locomotives and antique rolling stock. The statue of Cassatt stands in a room that bears no resemblance to the cathedral he built. He looks out at a gift shop. The man who ran the largest corporation in the world and risked its entire fortune on a single building now presides over a tourist attraction in Amish country. His sister Mary's paintings hang in the Metropolitan Museum, the Musée d'Orsay, the National Gallery. His statue stands in a room that sells model trains. In the 1990s, a journalist named Robert Sullivan attempted to find the column fragments in the Meadowlands. He had been given a list of addresses where the granite had reportedly been dumped. He drove through Secaucus and the surrounding towns, crossing and recrossing the marshland on roads that had not existed when the granite was deposited. When he visited the sites, he found that many of the addresses no longer existed. The land had been developed. Parking lots and warehouse complexes and strip malls covered the ground where the stone had been buried. The columns were down there somewhere, beneath the foundations of big box stores and office parks, but no one could say exactly where. The granite columns of Pennsylvania Station were still there, somewhere beneath the asphalt, but they could no longer be reached. They had become part of the geology of northern New Jersey, a layer of carved stone buried beneath layers of development, invisible and inaccessible. This is what happened to the physical remains of a building that took 7 years to construct and cost $2.7 billion in modern terms. Its granite was buried in a swamp. Its eagles were scattered. Its sculptures were broken. Its bronze was scrapped. Its architect's dream of Roman permanence was fulfilled in the most perverse way imaginable. The stone was indeed permanent. It would last for centuries, perhaps for millennia, buried in the earth of the Meadowlands. Unseen, unvisited, unmourned, the building was gone. But a new structure was rising on its grave, and it would inflict a final insult that even the most pessimistic preservationists had not anticipated. Chapter 9. One scuttles in now like a rat. The building that replaced Pennsylvania Station was despised from the moment it opened, and it has been despised every day since. The 4th Madison Square Garden, a circular concrete arena that resembled a massive drum dropped onto a city block, opened on February 11, 1968. Beneath it, the new Pennsylvania Station occupied the basement level, a warren of low-ceilinged corridors, fluorescent-lit passageways, and cramped waiting areas that bore no resemblance to the building they replaced. The architectural historian Vincent Scully delivered the epitaph that would define the replacement for the next 6 decades. Comparing the experience of arriving in New York through the old station and the new, he wrote that one entered the city like a god and one scuttles in now like a rat. The description was devastating because it was accurate. The original Pennsylvania station had been designed to make every passenger feel the significance of arrival. The soaring ceiling, the warm stone, the shafts of natural light, the proportions drawn from ancient Rome, all of it was intended to announce that you had arrived somewhere important, that the city welcomed you, that the act of stepping off a train was an event worthy of grandeur. The new station offered none of this. Its ceilings were low, barely 8 feet in some corridors. Its lighting was harsh and institutional, the kind of cold fluorescent tubes found in hospital basements and government offices. Its layout was confusing, a maze of unmarked tunnels and intersecting passageways that seemed designed to disorient rather than guide. Commuters who used the station daily still got lost in its corridors, walking the wrong way down identical hallways, doubling back through passages that all looked the same. Its walls were covered in commercial advertising, layer upon layer of posters and screens hawking products to a captive audience. Its floors were sticky, its air was stale, thick with the smell of exhaust and food grease and the accumulated humidity of hundreds of thousands of bodies moving through an enclosed space. The platforms, the same platforms the sandhogs had built, were now reached by narrow escalators and cramped stairways instead of the broad stone staircases of the original. At rush hour, the escalators could not handle the volume. Passengers queued in dense, frustrated lines, shuffling forward inches at a time, their faces lit by the greenish glow of overhead fixtures. There was no room to breathe. There was no space to look up. There was, in fact, nothing to look up at. 300,000 passengers a day passed through this space. Each one of them experienced something that the original station's designers would have considered a violation of the fundamental purpose of architecture, the deliberate creation of ugliness, of discomfort, of oppression. The new station did not welcome. It processed. It did not ennoble. It diminished. And yet, the cruelest irony was still ahead. The Pennsylvania Railroad had demolished its station to save itself. The building had been sacrificed on the altar of financial survival. The revenue from the air rights, the rent from the arena, the income from the office tower, all of this was supposed to keep the railroad alive in an age of highways and airplanes. The company had traded its soul for a business plan. The business plan failed. In 1968, the same year the new Madison Square Garden opened, the Pennsylvania Railroad merged with its ancient rival, the New York Central, to form the Penn Central Transportation Company. The merger was supposed to create a railroad colossus capable of surviving the decline of the industry. The combined system would stretch from New York to Chicago, from Boston to St. Louis. Two railroads that had been competitors for more than a century would now pool their resources, eliminate redundant lines, and cut costs to the bone. It was, on paper, a plan of impeccable logic. In practice, it was a disaster. The cultures of the two railroads were incompatible. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran on discipline, order, and hierarchy. The New York Central ran on informality and improvisation. When the two systems were merged, the operating practices clashed at every junction. Freight cars disappeared into the wrong yards. Schedules fell apart. Billing systems could not communicate with each other. The efficiencies that were supposed to save the company never materialized. Instead, the merger created new inefficiencies that accelerated the collapse. On June 21, 1970, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at that time, a collapse that shocked Wall Street and required federal intervention to prevent a cascade of failures across the transportation industry. The company that had been the largest corporation on Earth, the company that Alexander Cassatt had led, the company that had built the most beautiful train station in America and then torn it down to stay alive, was dead. It had survived the demolition of its masterpiece by 7 years. The destruction had been pointless. This is the moment that transforms the story of Penn Station from an architectural tragedy into something deeper. The building was not destroyed by cultural vandals who hated beauty. It was destroyed by desperate men making rational decisions within a system that could not value what was irreplaceable. They did the math. The math said to demolish. They demolished. And then the math betrayed them anyway. The station died for nothing. Its granite columns lay buried in a New Jersey swamp. Its eagles were scattered across the eastern seaboard. Its sculptures were broken. Its bronze was melted. Its waiting room, the room that had made a factory worker feel like a Roman senator, was replaced by a basement corridor that made everyone feel, and the company that had sacrificed all of this to survive did not survive. The anger that had burned through the protest marches and the newspaper editorials now transformed into something more durable. It became guilt. And guilt, as New York City was about to discover, could accomplish things that anger could not. Chapter 10. The law that guilt built. The destruction of Penn Station accomplished something that protest, editorial pages, and common sense had failed to achieve. It changed the law. The demolition had exposed a vulnerability in the legal fabric of every American city. A building could be a century old. It could be a masterpiece of design. It could be beloved by millions. And yet, if its owner chose to tear it down, there was nothing the public could do to stop it. The law recognized property rights. It did not recognize beauty. It did not recognize history. It did not recognize the idea that some buildings belong, in a moral sense, to everyone. The outcry over Penn Station gave politicians the political cover they needed to act. In April of 1965, less than 2 years after the demolition began, Mayor Robert Wagner signed the New York City Landmarks Law. The law created the Landmarks Preservation Commission, an independent city agency with the authority to designate individual buildings and entire neighborhoods as landmarks. Once designated, a building could not be significantly altered or demolished without the commission's approval. It was a revolutionary change. For the first time in New York's history, a private property owner could be told by the city government that a building was too important to destroy. The law balanced private property rights against the public interest in preserving the city's architectural heritage. It was imperfect. It was contested. Property owners denounced it as government overreach. Real estate developers warned that it would freeze the city in amber and prevent the kind of growth and renewal that had made New York the commercial capital of the world. And it was, without question, a direct response to the loss of Penn Station. The commission's first chairman was Jeffrey Platt, an architect who had watched the demolition with something approaching physical pain. The commission began its work by surveying the city's building stock, identifying structures of historical, architectural, and cultural significance. The task was enormous. New York contained hundreds of buildings that merited consideration. The commission had to develop criteria, hold public hearings, weigh competing interests, and build a legal record that could withstand court challenges. The commission moved quickly. Grand Central Terminal, the Vanderbilt family's great Beaux Arts station at 42nd Street, was designated a landmark in 1967. The designation was not symbolic. It was a shield. It meant that the building's owners could not tear it down, alter its facade, or destroy its interior without the commission's consent. The lesson of Penn Station had been learned, at least in the legal sense. The city now had the power to say no. The Landmarks Law spread. Cities across the United States, inspired by New York's example and haunted by their own losses, enacted similar legislation throughout the late 1960s and 70s. Boston passed its Landmarks Ordinance in 1965, the same year as New York. San Francisco followed, Chicago followed. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 established a federal framework for identifying and protecting historic properties. Within a decade of Penn Station's demolition, the legal architecture of historic preservation had been fundamentally transformed across the country. The guilt was productive. It built institutions that endure to this day. It created a legal framework that has saved thousands of buildings across 50 states. The National Register of Historic Places, the state historic preservation offices, the local landmarks commissions that exist in cities and towns from coast to coast, all of these trace their lineage, in some measure, back to the morning the jackhammers bit into pink granite on 7th Avenue. It was also, for Pennsylvania Station, much too late. The law that Penn Station's death created could not bring Penn Station back. The building that had been sacrificed was gone forever. You cannot unbreak a column. You cannot uncarve an eagle. You cannot reassemble a 150-foot ceiling from rubble buried in a swamp. The law was built on its grave, and the law was about to face its greatest test, at the train station across town, where the forces that had destroyed Penn Station were gathering once again. Hashtag Chapter 11. Jackie Kennedy AN The Battle for Grand Central. When Penn Central tried to build a 55-story tower on top of Grand Central Terminal, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis decided that New York would not make the same mistake twice. The crisis began in 1968, when Penn Central, the bankrupt successor to both the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, proposed to construct a massive office tower above Grand Central Terminal. The tower, designed by the architect Marcel Breuer, would have risen 55 stories above the landmark's Beaux Arts facade, obliterating the building's silhouette and transforming its interior. It was Penn Station all over again. A failing railroad looking to monetize the air rights above a beautiful old building. The same financial logic, the same desperation, the same willingness to sacrifice beauty for revenue. But this time, there was a law. The Landmarks Preservation Commission rejected the proposal. Penn Central sued, arguing that the Landmarks Law constituted an unconstitutional taking of private property without just compensation. The company's lawyers made a powerful argument. If the government prevented an owner from developing property to its highest economic use, that was the legal equivalent of seizing the property without paying for it. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution prohibited exactly this kind of government action. If the city wanted to preserve Grand Central, the city should buy it. The case wound its way through the courts for nearly a decade. The stakes were enormous. If Penn Central won, the Landmarks Law would be gutted. Property owners across the city would be free to demolish or alter any designated building, rendering the Commission's designations meaningless. The entire legal framework that had been built in response to Penn Station's destruction would collapse. Every building the Commission had designated, every neighborhood it had protected, would be vulnerable again. In January of 1975, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis held a press conference at the Oyster Bar, the famous restaurant in the lower level of Grand Central Terminal. She was, at that time, the most famous woman in the United States, and perhaps the most recognized face her presence transformed the fight for Grand Central from a legal dispute into a national cause. She stood in the vaulted tile ceiling of the restaurant, surrounded by reporters and cameras, and spoke with quiet intensity about the importance of preserving the city's architectural heritage, about the duty of each generation to protect what it had inherited. She said that if Grand Central were destroyed, the city would lose something that could never be replaced. The press covered her remarks extensively. The public responded. Letters poured into City Hall. The issue that had been a matter of courtroom briefs and legal arguments became, overnight, a matter of popular passion. Jackie Kennedy had given the fight a face, a voice, and an urgency that the lawyers and the preservationists had not been able to create on their own. The case reached the United States Supreme Court. On June 26, 1978, the court issued its decision in Penn Central Transportation Co. v. City of New York. By a vote of 6-3, the justices upheld the constitutionality of the New York City Landmarks Law. Justice William Brennan, writing for the majority, held that the Landmarks Law did not constitute a taking of property under the Fifth Amendment. The regulation served a legitimate public purpose, and the property owner retained a reasonable economic return on the property even with the landmark restrictions in place. The public interest in preserving historic buildings was a legitimate exercise of government power. The decision was a watershed. It established the constitutional foundation for landmark preservation laws across the entire country. Every historic district designation, every landmark protection, every preservation battle fought in every city and town in America rests, in some measure, on the legal principles established in this case. The two stations became linked parables of American architecture. Penn Station was the sin. Grand Central was the redemption. Penn Station was destroyed because no law could save it. Grand Central was saved because Penn Station's destruction had created the law. The ghost of Penn Station had done what the living building could not. It had changed the rules. But ghosts do not rest easily, and Penn Station's was no exception. The question of what to do about the underground station, the grim, oppressive replacement that 300,000 people endured every day, would take another 4 decades to even partially answer. Chapter 12, what the columns remember. Somewhere beneath parking lots in the Meadowlands, the pink granite columns of Pennsylvania Station are still there. Buried but not, they lie in darkness, beneath layers of asphalt and compacted earth, in marshland that once surrounded pig farms and now supports shopping centers and warehouse complexes. The stone has not decayed. Granite does not decay. It is one of the most durable materials on Earth, formed by the slow cooling of magma deep in the planet's crust, compressed over millions of years into a crystalline matrix that resists erosion, weathering, and time. The columns that line 7th Avenue are still pink. They are still carved. They are still there. They will outlast everything that was built on top of them. In January of 2021, the Moynihan Train Hall opened across 8th Avenue from the site of the original station. Named for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the New York senator who had championed the project for decades, the train hall occupies the former James A. Farley Post Office building, a Beaux-Arts structure designed by McKim, Mead and White as a companion piece to the original station. Its Corinthian columns echo the Doric columns of Penn Station. Its grand staircase recalls the broad stone steps that once descended to the platforms. The Moynihan Train Hall is an act of architectural atonement. Its designers sought to restore something of the dignity and grandeur that was destroyed in 1963. The main hall features a skylight of glass and steel that floods the space with natural light, a conscious echo of the original station's glass concourse. The proportions are generous. The materials are warm. The intention is clear, to give passengers, at last, a room that treats their arrival as an event of consequence. It is beautiful. It is also, in a sense, an admission. The city built it because it knew that what it had allowed to happen was wrong. 60 years of institutional effort, political negotiation, and public expenditure went into creating a partial substitute for what was destroyed in 3 years. The atonement is genuine. It is also incomplete. The Moynihan Train Hall serves only Amtrak passengers. The 300,000 daily commuters who use New Jersey Transit and the Long Island Railroad still descend into the cramped, oppressive corridors of the underground station beneath Madison Square Garden. The garden itself remains a subject of perpetual controversy. Its operating permit has become a recurring political battle, with city officials debating whether the arena should be allowed to remain on the site or relocated to make way for a full reconstruction of the station. The building that replaced Penn Station has never been accepted by the city. It sits on the grave of a masterpiece, and the city has never stopped resenting it. But beneath the garden, beneath the corridors and the escalators, and the fluorescent lights, the original tunnels remain. The tubes that the sandhogs bored through the bedrock beneath the Hudson River between 1904 and 1908 are still in daily service. 300,000 passengers ride through them every day. The brass banisters on certain staircases still bear their original X-shaped molding, a small detail that has survived more than a century of use. If you know where to look, you can touch them. You can feel the handiwork of men who built this place when Theodore Roosevelt was president. The tunnels remember what the surface has forgotten. A civilization reveals its values not in what it builds, but in what it chooses to preserve and what it allows to be destroyed. The Romans built the baths of Caracalla to serve a population of 1 million. The baths survived for 3 centuries before they were abandoned, and their ruins have stood for 17 centuries more. Charles McKim walked through those ruins and imagined a train station that would carry their spirit into the modern world. His station survived 53 years, roughly a single human working life. It was not destroyed by war or earthquake or flood. It was destroyed by a spreadsheet. The revenue per square foot of a modern office building exceeded the revenue per square foot of a granite train station. And in a society that measured all value in revenue, that equation was a death sentence. The 6 decades of guilt, legislation, litigation, and architectural atonement that followed suggest that the loss was understood as more than an architectural tragedy. It was understood as a moral failure. The city had inherited something irreplaceable and treated it as disposable. It had weighed beauty against revenue and chosen revenue. And then it had spent the rest of the century trying to undo what it had done, knowing that it could not. Pennsylvania Station was built by men who believed that public space should ennoble ordinary life. It was designed so that a factory worker and a railroad president would enter through the same columns and sit beneath the same ceiling and feel the same sense of arrival. It expressed a conviction that the act of traveling, of moving through the world and arriving in a great city, deserved a room that honored the traveler. That room is gone. The columns are buried. The eagles are scattered. The ceiling that rose 150 feet above the waiting room floor exists now only in photographs, in the memories of people who are themselves disappearing, and in the laws that were written in its name. But somewhere in the meadowlands, the granite endures, pink and carved and silent, waiting in the dark for someone to remember why it mattered. Any city gets what it admires, will pay for, and, ultimately,